John had a car accident and lost his memory, forgetting that we were already married. When I went to the hospital to see him, he acted cold and indifferent, suppressing the ache in my heart. I walked out of the room. Just as I stepped outside, I heard him speak excitedly. It's over. I've fallen in love. I've fallen in love at first sight with that girl who just left. I can't imagine how happy I'd be if she were my wife. Hearing this, I froze. As the person who was already his wife, the words hit me like a bolt of ice. I rushed to the hospital, pushed open the door to his room, and saw him casually chatting and laughing with his friend, Luke. Seeing that John was physically fine, I let out a sigh of relief and quickly walked over to him. My heart was still pounding with fear, and my eyes were slightly red. John looked up at me, visibly confused. "Why were you so careless?" I said, my voice trembling as I tried to hold back tears. He stared at me, bewildered, and glanced at Luke for help. I frowned. "Don't even think about making Luke take the blame." John turned back to look at me and hesitantly asked, "Do you know me?" I was stunned. Regaining my composure, I grew angry. "John, is now the time to joke with me?" I reached out to grab his shirt, but he dodged me like I was some sort of threat. His expression was a mix of caution and alarm as he said, "Mississippi, I don't know you. Can you not touch me?" My hand froze mid-air, and I stood there in shock, staring at his face. Slowly, I realized he wasn't lying. In the years we'd been together, I had learned to read all his little tells. His current behavior clearly showed he had lost his memory. He had forgotten me and the fact that we were married. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. Seeing me cry, John's expression turned uneasy. He hesitated, lifting his hand as if to wipe away my tears, but then pulled back. I wiped my tears with my own hand and looked at Luke, who stood nearby. Meeting my gaze, Luke explained, "The doctor said there's still some blood clotting in his brain, so he might forget some things." Forget some things? He had forgotten everything about me. John's eyes were filled with unfamiliarity as he looked at me, and my heart felt like it was being crushed. "I'll go ask the doctor," I mumbled before fleeing the room in a panic. Outside, I leaned against the door, trying to steady myself. Just as I was about to leave, I heard John's voice again from inside the room, sounding excited. "It's over. I've fallen in love. I've fallen in love at first sight with that girl who just left. I can't imagine how happy I'd be if she were my wife." As his actual wife, my sadness vanished entirely in an instant. Inside, Luke froze for a moment, then smirked and said, "What's stopping you from chasing her? Don't you know her?" John's voice grew louder with excitement. "Really? No wonder she came rushing over as soon as I had the accident. Are we close?" Luke replied playfully, "You two have a complicated relationship." "How complicated?" John asked. "You live together." John looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "We live together?" Seeing John's confusion, Luke, taking full advantage of the situation, continued to mess with him. "Why would I live with her? Did I force her into it?" John asked, still struggling to make sense of things. Luke couldn't hold back anymore and burst into laughter. Truly, a loyal friend. Back when we first met, John had been the one to like me first, but for some reason, he listened to someone's lies and didn't openly pursue me. Instead, he chose to subtly string me along. I was completely hooked by him. How could I not be? His perfect abs, narrow waist, and ridiculously handsome face made it impossible not to fall for him. Thinking about this, I decided against barging in to tell him the truth. Karma always comes full circle. It was his turn to chase after me this time. And this time, he had to confess first. The doctor told me that John's condition wasn't too serious. With a few months of rest, he should fully recover. After leaving the consultation room, I went straight home. I carefully stored away our wedding photos and moved all my personal belongings from the master bedroom into the guest room. Once I was sure there wouldn't be any clues left behind, I returned to the hospital. When John saw me again, his previously aloof demeanor was gone. He looked at me, lowering his voice to ask, "I heard that we live together?" Luke, standing next to him, was trying so hard not to laugh that it looked like he might hurt himself. I held back my own laughter and replied with a straight face, "To be precise, it's more like we share an apartment." Share an apartment? John looked utterly baffled. With you. You made some bad investments, lost all your savings, and ran out of income. I said. You were left with nothing but a house with an unpaid mortgage. You had no choice but to find a roommate to help cover expenses. I wasn't lying. This was the exact excuse John had once used to convince me to live with him. Back then, I had actually believed it. John froze for a few seconds, then turned to Luke with disbelief. Luke quickly wiped the grin off his face, patted John's shoulder, and sighed. Bro, that's exactly how it is. You're broke now. Last month, you even had to borrow money from me to pay the mortgage. Luke really was something else. He could lie so smoothly without even pausing to think. I'm completely broke? John closed his eyes, looking utterly defeated, as if his world had collapsed. I could understand. After all, who wouldn't feel crushed if they suddenly discovered they'd not only lost 3 years of memories, but also gone from being a rich heir to flat broke? He looked at me hesitantly and asked, Are you saying I'm living off you now? He looked so adorable in that moment. If I weren't in the middle of keeping up this act, I probably would have kissed him right then. Pushing aside the inappropriate thought, I responded as calmly as possible. That's not exactly right. We're just landlord and tenant. Our relationship sounded so simple that John seemed a bit disappointed. Luke caught my eye, and I instantly understood what he wanted. He thought this situation was amusing and wanted to keep playing along, putting on his best innocent act. Luke said, Miss Yates, John's not in the best shape right now. Could I trouble you to take care of him for the next month or two? Just make sure he has something to eat. It could count toward his rent. Hearing this, John's eyes lit up like he'd just found the perfect plan. His expression practically screamed, Why didn't I think of that? What a great idea. My brilliant friend. I didn't answer immediately, pretending to be hesitant. John looked up at me, his gaze cautious and pleading. Would that be okay? He had reeled me in years ago with that same innocent face. I couldn't believe he was still using it after all this time. Smiling slightly, I replied, All right then. John only stayed in the hospital for a few days before returning home. To make this act more convincing, I moved into the guest room and even secretly changed the contact name he had saved for me in his phone. But habits are a scary thing. Without John hugging me to sleep, I found myself struggling with insomnia. Playing with my phone only made me more restless. The more I scrolled, the more awake I became. That's when I stumbled upon a post on a familiar account. It was John's. I knew he usually used this account to answer professional questions. Yet, just half an hour ago, among John's usual posts, there was one that stood out awkwardly. I've fallen in love at first sight with my roommate. How can I win them over? The responses underneath were all over the place. You're already living together, and you still haven't made a move? Buddy, you need to work on your game. If you've got money, use it. If you've got the looks, seduce them. If you can cook, win their stomach. If you have none of the above, dream on. Just go for it. Be a man. Apparently unsatisfied with these suggestions, John added more context. I should mention, I don't have a job. I'm their landlord/roommate, and I'm surviving on their rent. This comment unleashed a flood of ridicule in the replies. You might as well keep dreaming. Strong suspicion that you're just scaring your tenant to raise rent. Bro, your top priority should be finding a job, not chasing after someone. Knowing John as well as I did, I was certain these comments would only fuel his determination. He'd always been the type to succeed through sheer perseverance. And it was exactly how he'd won me over before. Feeling mischievous, I decided to play along and commented, Are you sure your roommate is single? Within minutes of posting that comment, I received a text from John on WeChat. Are you still awake? Not yet. What's up? I have a question for you. What is it? Do you have a boyfriend? Seeing this, I couldn't help but laugh quietly. Even through the closed door between us, I could almost hear the excitement in his voice. Smiling, I replied, No, but I'm married. Maybe I went a bit too far because John didn't reply for a full 10 minutes. Worried he might actually give up, I decided to clarify and got up to talk to him. The moment I opened my door, I found him standing right there. When our eyes met, he looked startled and a little guilty. as if I'd caught him doing something wrong. After hesitating for a moment, he finally asked, with a hint of reluctance, "Are you really married?" I didn't say anything, just sighed softly. My silence and hesitation seemed to crush him completely. His expression turned bitter. His eyes filled with defeat. I couldn't bear it. How could I? When he was looking at me with those eyes, so perfectly aligned with my soft spot? Giving in. I said, "All right, fine." I was lying. John's expression instantly shifted from despair to joy. If he had a tail, it would have been wagging uncontrollably. Feeling conflicted, I added, "There's just been too many people harassing me under the pretense of chasing me. So, I started telling people I'm married and live with my husband. If this bothers you, I can move out tomorrow." I lowered my head slowly, doing my best to look pitiful. No. It doesn't bother me at all," John said quickly, as if afraid I might start packing my things right away. "Really?" I looked up at him with a soft smile, my voice gentle. "You're so kind, John." His ears turned red in an instant, and he stammered, "I am okay. I'm not that great or anything." Realizing he was losing his composure, he stiffened and awkwardly said, "I'll go back to my room and sleep now. Good night." "Good night." He walked away so clumsily, his movements almost synchronized, as if he didn't know what to do with his hands and feet. The first thing John did after returning to his room was reply to my earlier comment. "No, they're single. Also, they've been telling people I'm their husband." Though the love he claimed to feel was fake, still made me smile. But sooner or later, it would become real. After all, I had the strength and the means to make it happen. John's bold declaration attracted a flood of ideas from people trying to help him. Among them, one particularly ridiculous suggestion caught his attention from a commenter with the username "My brother isn't too bright." "Listen to me, buddy. Use your best assets to charm them. For example, do you have abs? If you do, make sure to show them off subtly, just enough to tease. That kind of almost covered, almost bare approach is the most irresistible." I had a strong suspicion this was the same person who gave John advice 3 years ago. God knows that when I first saw his abs, I instantly realized that our roommate relationship was about to change. 3 years have passed, and I'm not the same naive girl who drooled over such things. Abs? Just abs? How could they possibly captivate me again? But they did. Damn it. How could I fall for the same abs twice? I watched as John, pretending to be casual but obviously trying too hard, walked out of his room wearing nothing but a towel. My face betrayed me, turning red against my will. What was wrong with me? After 3 years, how could I still not get enough of this sight? I coughed to cover my embarrassment and turned my head away, trying to look unaffected despite the storm raging inside me. "Maybe you should put on some clothes," I said with a straight face. John, still flaunting his physique, looked puzzled. I added seriously, "The flu is going around, and you'll get sick like this. If you do, you might pass it to me, and then I won't be able to work. If I can't work, I won't be able to pay rent." John blinked at me, looking completely thrown off. I thought I'd crushed his ego, but instead, he grinned widely and said, "Got it. I'll put on clothes right now." Something felt off. Very off. I couldn't figure out why he'd reacted like that. True to his word, John quickly got dressed and came back to sit across from me. He was holding his phone, sneaking glances at me every few seconds. Suspicious. I pretended to scroll through my phone while trying to figure out what he was up to. That's when I saw his latest comment under the "My brother isn't too bright" post. It worked. Bro. He's concerned about me getting sick, worried I might pass it to him, and even more worried that if I can't pay rent, we won't be able to live together. Don't you think he might like me too? Completely misunderstanding me, John's inner monologue left me speechless. 2 years of marriage, and I still struggled to follow his train of thought sometimes. How could someone be so good at convincing themselves? Even "My brother isn't too bright" seemed at a loss. Replying. Did they blush, breathe heavily, or avoid eye contact? No, but they cared about me. Maybe they're just worried about losing their place to stay. No way. They're clearly concerned about staying with me specifically. Fine. Let's leave that for now. Try this. Play the wounded soul card. Pretend you've had a traumatic childhood. tug at their heartstrings. That's how love begins. But my childhood was great. Ever heard of exaggeration? Use it. Got it. Bro. You're a genius. Seeing that response gave me a sinking feeling. No way. He wouldn't. Would he? Not that story again. I glanced at John sitting across from me. When our eyes met, he immediately looked away, as if afraid I'd see through whatever he was planning. After dinner, things took a turn. I was just about to take a shower when John's phone suddenly rang. He glanced at me before answering the call. I recognized the voice on the other end. It was his cousin. John responded absent-mindedly. I'm fine. It's just a minor scrape. Don't worry about me. I have someone taking care of me. When the voice on the phone replied with skepticism, John looked at me, then handed me the phone with a pleading expression. Do me a favor, he whispered. I don't want my family to worry. I hesitated for a moment before taking the phone. His cousin's voice immediately greeted me. Sister-in-law? I froze but managed not to give anything away. Then she added, my brother just texted me saying he's going to pursue you. Is this some kind of cosplay game you two are playing? I had to admit, John's personality after losing his memory was hilariously consistent with how he was before. His cousin was already aware of his amnesia, and had even agreed to help me play along. Holding back my laughter, I met John's gaze and said in a calm tone, you don't need to thank me. After all, he's my roommate. His cousin chuckled and complimented my acting skills before hanging up. John took the phone back, sighed deeply, and then sighed again for good measure. I ignored him at first, but when he sighed a third time, I couldn't help but feel amused. Feigning concern, I asked, what's wrong? He immediately seized the opportunity, his voice full of melancholy. Hearing my cousin reminded me of something that happened when I was in first grade. Here we go again. Though I'd heard this story no fewer than 800 times, I pretended to be clueless. What happened? I asked, playing along. Seeing that I'd taken the bait, John's lips almost curled into a smirk, but he caught himself. It's nothing big, he began, his tone sorrowful. It's just that when my cousin was born, I wanted to go see her, but my parents scolded me and even spanked me. They said kids shouldn't stick their noses where they don't belong. The more he talked, the more miserable he sounded, until finally, he hung his head like someone abandoned by the world. The first time I heard this story, I already had a bit of a crush on John. His tale of childhood pain was so raw and heartfelt that I couldn't help but feel moved. For a long time afterward, I genuinely felt sorry for him. It wasn't until after we got married that I subtly asked his mom about it. That's when I learned the truth. Back then, John's teacher had asked the students to bring their favorite thing to school for show and tell. He, in his infinite wisdom, decided to sneak his newborn cousin to school. His parents were frantic. The teacher was terrified, and his classmates were stunned. Meanwhile, he was feeling smug about it. His cousin must have agreed to help with this little charade to get back at him for that incident. When John finished his story, he snuck a glance at me, clearly hoping for some sort of reaction. Knowing the truth now, I felt more pity for my past self than for him. Meeting his expectant gaze, I replied coolly, you got spanked, and you deserved it. It's all in the past now. John's sorrowful expression froze mid-face. Deserved it, he repeated, incredulous. Yes, I said, nodding matter-of-factly. Think about it. Your cousin had just been born. You were just a little kid. What if your clumsy hands had hurt her? And with so many people at the hospital, what if you'd lost her when no one was paying attention? John no longer looked upset. Instead, he was utterly shocked. Does that mean I shouldn't blame my parents for this? Of course. You smuggled your cousin into school. Who wouldn't get punished for that? After my shower, I came out to find that John had gone back to talking with my brother isn't too bright. For reasons beyond me, they refused to use private messages and were holding their entire conversation in the comments section. Not only was I watching their antics unfold, but a large crowd of strangers seemed to be eagerly waiting for updates too. Bro. Thank you so much. John wrote. After hearing about my childhood trauma, he softened my relationship with my parents. He must like me. Right. My brother isn't too bright clearly didn't buy it and began asking for details. After hearing John's explanation, They were left speechless. You think he feels bad for you? Why wouldn't he? John replied. He was worried I might lose my cousin at the hospital. Isn't that proof he cares about me? Fine. If you say so. Listen. Bro, they continued. This is your last move. It's a surefire win. Everyone knows the saying. A man shows 3 parts vulnerability. And love starts when tears fall. Pretend to be drunk. It's the perfect way to escalate the relationship. But I don't drink. John wrote back. You don't need to actually drink. Just make sure you smell like alcohol. Got it. And I got it too. So John had faked being drunk back then. I finally understood why. In 3 years, I'd only ever seen him drink that one time. I sat on my bed and couldn't help but laugh in exasperation. Who loses their memory and still uses the exact same tactics to pursue someone? About an hour later, I heard a loud thud outside my door. It was starting. John's Oscar-worthy performance. The thought of having to act alongside him made me want to laugh. But John was persistent. I heard him continue to make noise outside. So I mentally prepared myself before opening the door. In the dimly lit living room, I saw a figure collapse dramatically to the ground, followed by the sound of a bottle and glass clinking together. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated the scene. John lying on the floor with an empty bottle of 1982 Lafite that I had asked someone to buy for me. The sheer cost of this performance made my heart ache for a moment, but I forced myself to step closer. The overpowering smell of alcohol surrounded him. A few buttons on his shirt were undone, exposing his well-defined collarbones. I couldn't help but swallow hard. Damn it. Once again, I was distracted by his looks. John looked at me with a hazy smile, his words slurring as he said something about misunderstanding them. By them, I assumed he meant his parents. He'd somehow roped his newfound regret about misunderstanding his parents into this elaborate charade, making his drunken sorrow seem almost reasonable. I had to admit, he was good at this. After all, it was this kind of performance that had tricked me in the first place. I reached out to support his swaying body, my tone tinged with frustration. Why are you drinking? You just had a car accident. Do you not care about yourself at all? John mumbled a quiet rebuttal. I didn't drink much. Not much. I retorted, gesturing at the empty bottle. This whole thing is gone. And you call that not much? He looked at me, his face breaking into a cheeky smile. You're worried about me, aren't you? I almost blurted out instinctively. Of course I'm worried. After all, you're my... I hesitated. My boss. John looked disappointed, mumbling under his breath. But I don't want to be your boss. I raised an eyebrow. Then what do you want to be? In the moonlight, I could only see his eyes, clear and serious. 3 years ago, when he pretended to be drunk, he had the same expression. Back then, I thought he was truly drunk and didn't notice the barely concealed affection in his gaze. The world was completely silent, and I could hear nothing but his heartbeat. John opened his mouth as if to say something, but without the courage alcohol had provided back then, he couldn't bring himself to confess. I was annoyed. When I confessed my feelings back then, it was straightforward and bold. Now, he was dragging this out endlessly. 3 years ago, I seized the moment and kissed him when I thought he was drunk. 3 years later, I decided to do it again. I leaned in and pressed my lips to his. John's eyes were wide with shock, his entire body frozen stiff. When I pulled back, we locked eyes. John, will you still remember this tomorrow morning? He nodded, then quickly shook his head, looking utterly confused and overwhelmed. I chuckled. We'll see about that tomorrow. For now, go get some sleep. Of course, he didn't sleep. Instead, he excitedly messaged my brother isn't too bright to share his joy. She kissed me. What does this mean? Does it mean she likes me? My brother isn't too bright didn't respond, but the other commenters exploded. What the hell? That worked. Oh, so this was just some couple's game all along. I thought these tips were actually useful. LOL. Serious doubts that this whole post wasn't just a prank to begin with. Dude, stop fooling your friends and don't fool yourself either. John replied furiously to every single comment, defending his position. I watched the whole exchange with amusement before finally putting my phone away and going to sleep. The next morning, John showed up in the kitchen with dark circles under his eyes. It was obvious he hadn't slept well, but I had slept like a baby. I casually ate my breakfast while he sat across from me, nervously fidgeting. He stared at me for 10 minutes, waiting for me to say something, but I remained silent, unable to hold back any longer. He finally spoke hesitantly. About last night. Last night. You drank too much, I said calmly. And then what? That's it, I replied nonchalantly. The light in John's eyes instantly dimmed. He looked at me, aggrieved. How can you not take responsibility? For what? I asked, pretending not to understand. You kissed me last night, he said, his voice full of conviction. So you have to take responsibility. I smirked slightly. You remember that so clearly. Huh? Didn't you drink quite a bit last night? John avoided my gaze, his voice dropping to a murmur. I'm different from others. I set down my sandwich and looked at him seriously. All right. I admit it. The relationship between us isn't exactly simple. The light returned to his eyes, and his voice trembled with excitement. Then what kind of relationship do we have? I paused for a moment, savoring his anticipation, before answering slowly. We're just friends. Friends, he repeated, stunned. Friends who occasionally kiss but don't take responsibility for it. I added, deadpan. The world seemed to collapse around John. His voice trembled as he asked, have you become this open-minded in the last 3 years? He looked like he'd suffered a huge blow, lowering my head in mock regret. I said, if you can't accept this, I suppose I could always find someone else. Absolutely not. John blurted out, although he hadn't fully accepted my open-minded version of our relationship. He was even less willing to accept the idea of me being with someone else. After a moment, he asked cautiously, so, in this pure friendship of ours, what exactly does it involve? Completely unbothered, I replied, kissing. Of course. John's mouth twitched. Just kissing? Yeah, just for fun, I said matter-of-factly. It was as if his brain short-circuited. I think I need some time to process this, he muttered, before retreating to his room like he'd just seen a ghost. Watching his retreating figure, I couldn't help but smile as I pulled out my phone. As expected, he had gone straight back to my brother isn't too bright for advice. Bro, everything's falling apart, he wrote. She said we're just in a pure friendship. And pure friendship means kissing. The reply came quickly. What the hell? It was clear my brother isn't too bright was equally as shocked. Moments later, I received a text from Luke. Sister-in-law. You're amazing. I admit defeat. I don't think he can keep up this act anymore. I replied, don't sell yourself short. After all, you've been John's wingman for 3 years. Luke caved instantly. Fine. You win. I'll confess. I was the one who gave John those ideas in the first place. Just don't tell him that my brother isn't too bright is actually me. Please. Sister-in-law. Have mercy. It all made sense now. Luke had been the mastermind behind those ridiculous strategies. If he hadn't been recycling the same 3 moves every time, I might never have figured it out. Since John found out about our so-called pure friendship, he had been avoiding me but couldn't stop himself from trying to get close. He seemed deeply conflicted. Part of him thought our relationship was too improper, while another part believed that an improper relationship was still better than being mere roommates. As luck would have it, a high school reunion was coming up, and everyone was encouraged to bring a +1. I decided this would be the perfect opportunity to give John the final push. This time, he had to confess. When I told John about the reunion, he immediately looked like he wanted to run away. I cornered him, leaving him no escape. He couldn't even look me in the eye. If you're uncomfortable, I said, I can just move out. I'm not uncomfortable, he blurted out, though his furrowed brow told a different story. It was practically as deep as the Mariana Trench. Then will you come with me to the reunion? Me? He asked, caught off guard. Yes, you. A flicker of excitement crossed his face, but it was so brief I almost missed it. And what would my role be? I gave him a playful wink. Obviously, you'll go as my husband. Hearing that, John stopped avoiding me altogether. It felt like our previously ambiguous relationship had finally been brought into the light. On the day of the reunion, John stepped out of his room wearing a tailored suit. He looked so stunning that my heart skipped a beat, but I quickly recovered and told him to change. He frowned, clearly reluctant. What if your high school crush shows up? I can't lose to him. I laughed helplessly and pulled a more casual outfit from his closet. He grumbled a bit, but obediently changed into it. When he came back, I nodded in approval. Perfect. Now that we're wearing matching outfits, it's obvious we're a couple. My comment seemed to brighten his mood instantly. When we arrived at the reunion on the 9th floor, most of the attendees were already there. As soon as Suyu, one of my old classmates, saw me, she stood up to greet us. I held John's hand as we walked over and sat next to her. She looked at me, then at John, and teased, "Your husband looks a bit different from how I remember him." "Well, he's definitely changed," I said, smiling. "He used to have a buzz cut and a bad boy vibe. Now, with those curls, he looks more like a puppy. If I didn't look closely, I'd think you brought a different husband this time," Suyu said casually, though she meant nothing by it. John's reaction was immediate. His eyes darkened, and the light in them flickered as his thoughts churned. He quickly jumped to the conclusion that I'd brought someone else to past gatherings, and seemed determined to reclaim some ground. "I did switch," John said, his tone seemingly casual. "For someone better looking." So you thought he was joking and laughed heartily, completely oblivious to the increasingly gloomy air surrounding John. This was surprisingly entertaining. After all, I'd never seen John get jealous of himself before. Strategically, he picked up his glass of water and stole a glance at me while taking a sip, clearly waiting for me to offer an explanation. I pretended not to notice and continued chatting with Suyu, thoroughly enjoying myself. After a few minutes, he couldn't hold back anymore. Leaning close to my ear, he asked in a low, slightly menacing voice, "Were you and him in that kind of relationship too?" Feigning ignorance, I replied, "Him? Who?" "Your senior," he said through gritted teeth. I couldn't stop myself from bursting into laughter. Who calls a love rival their senior? And what kind of relationship would that be? I teased. He forced out 3 bitter words. "Pure friendship." I didn't reply, simply smiling at him instead, misunderstanding my silence as agreement. He muttered something even more sour. "Three's a crowd in friendship. You know." His misunderstanding was so thorough that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I decided to clear things up. After all, he was my husband. Crooking my finger at him, I gestured for him to come closer. After a few moments of hesitation, he leaned in, bringing his ear near my lips. "John," I whispered, my breath brushing against his cheek. "He and I are in a pure friendship. I've only ever kissed you." Then I turned my head slightly and planted a quick, feather-like kiss on his cheek. John froze, completely still, as if someone had hit his pause button. His face flushed bright red at a speed visible to the naked eye. When he finally realized what had happened, he made a flurry of awkward movements, trying to contain his obvious delight but failing miserably. He retreated to the corner, clearly overjoyed, but his expression grew thoughtful as if he were mulling something over. Suddenly, his face turned resolute, as though he'd made an important decision. I watched him curiously as he pulled out his phone and started typing. Moments later, "Luke sent me a message. Sister-in-law. You should see this." Attached was a screenshot of John's private message to my brother isn't too bright, aka Luke. "Bro, I've decided to confess. She definitely likes me. She said she's only ever kissed me." After reading it, I stared at my screen in silence. John was so lucky he was dealing with me. With anyone else, his overactive imagination and tendency to strategize himself into love would have gotten him scammed. If someone ever sold him off, he'd probably say, "See? They only sold me. That means they care about me." The rest of the reunion passed with John remaining on high alert, unable to relax. When we finally left the 9th floor, the evening breeze sent a shiver through me. John noticed immediately, shrugged off his jacket, and draped it over my shoulders. The familiar, faint scent of him enveloped me like a long-lost comfort. Looking at him standing in front of me, I couldn't hold back anymore and threw myself into his arms. Wrapping my arms around his waist, I pressed myself against him, feeling the warmth of his body. John didn't push me away. Instead, his arms instinctively came up to hold me close. I knew this was just a natural reaction from the many times we'd hugged, but maybe it was the moonlight or the overwhelming love we couldn't suppress anymore. John held me tightly, and in a soft, steady voice, he finally said what I'd been longing to hear. Whether it's pure friendship or something else, I can't keep pretending anymore. Every time I see you, my heartbeat tells me I like you. I could feel the vibrations of his voice from his chest, and knew clearly that his heart was beating for me at this moment. So, I replied simply, "Then let's be together." Being with John again felt unexpectedly fresh and exciting. Even though we'd technically been married for 2 years, he'd already evolved into a calm and restrained husband. But now, he was back to being the playful, flirty puppy he'd been before marriage. Anyone who saw us would say, "You're living the good life." Most importantly, even though John had lost his memory, his cooking skills remained intact. He often looked puzzled while cooking, muttering to himself, "I've never learned this, so how do I know it so well?" He chalked it up to natural talent and almost signed up for a cooking competition. I managed to convince him otherwise by saying, "I just want you to cook for me." From then on, he became even more enthusiastic about making me delicious meals. The food was so good that my stomach couldn't handle it. After a checkup at the hospital, the doctor gave me 2 pieces of news. First, my stomach was perfectly fine. Second, I was pregnant. Holding the report, I stood there in a daze, mentally calculating the timeline. I finally realized it must have happened the night before John's car accident. Over a month ago. I accepted the news quickly since this had always been part of our plan. But I forgot that this plan had been made before John lost his memory. Now, standing in the hospital corridor, John was holding the report, completely dumbfounded. He looked like he'd been turned to stone, trembling as he met my gaze. "Whose baby is this?" "Yours," I said. John let out a bitter laugh. "As far as I know, kissing doesn't lead to pregnancy." He paused for a few seconds, then added thoughtfully, "Unless technology has advanced so much in the past 3 years that kissing can get someone pregnant now?" At that moment, I finally understood why people say women in love are like they've had 3 bottles of strong liquor. Looking at John's thought process, I wondered how I'd ever been so smitten with him, falling for his charm so hard it turned me into a fool. Feeling both helpless and amused, I said, "Let's go home. I'll explain everything there." Once we got home, I pulled out our marriage certificate from the cabinet. When John saw the bright red booklet, he froze again, completely shattered. "You're married," he stammered. "Am I the other man?" "No, you're not. Not even the other man? Then am I the third party?" John's face turned increasingly pale as he spiraled. "It can't be the fourth, right?" His voice quivered, and his eyes reddened as if he were about to cry. Seeing him like this, I panicked and rushed to comfort him. "Don't cry, John. You're my husband." John stubbornly turned his head away. "If I'm the third party, can't I cry about it? And don't call me your husband. You already have a legitimate one. I'm just some shameful third wheel, aren't I?" What was even happening? How had he downgraded himself from the main character to this? Exasperated, I grabbed our wedding photo album and shoved it in his hands. "Read this." John, still miserable, hesitated. "Isn't this a bit too cruel for a third party?" Despite his protest, he looked at the photo and started reading in a robotic tone. Word by word. "Certificate holders, Eugene and John." Wait, wait, he exclaimed. John grabbed the marriage certificate from my hands like he just won the lottery. He glanced at the photo, then at the names of the certificate holders, and completely lost it with joy. 2 years ago, I really pulled this off, didn't I?" he exclaimed, his voice full of pride. He immediately clutched the document like it was a trophy, pulled me into his arms, and buried his face in the crook of my neck. "I'm so happy. Today is the best day ever. I not only have a wife but also a child." John did end up crying, but this time, they were tears of happiness. Ever since I got pregnant, John had practically glued himself to me, acting like he needed to be by my side 24/7. His memory hadn't returned yet, so I consulted the doctor. The doctor assured me that the blood clots in his brain had mostly cleared, But when his memory might come back was still uncertain. John, however, didn't seem to care. It doesn't matter, he said. I love you just the same. I thought about it and realized he was right. There was no point in dwelling on it. So I let it go. One morning, though, he suddenly came running from the living room to the bedroom, practically bouncing with excitement. Honey, you're pregnant, he shouted, his tone full of delight. I rolled my eyes at him. I'm about to give birth. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized something was off. Wait, you've got your memory back, haven't you? John walked up and gently supported me as I sat up. He nodded, a sheepish smile on his face. Immediately, I felt a pang of guilt as I remembered all the things I'd done while he was suffering from amnesia. Without a second thought, I started apologizing. I'm sorry, honey. I shouldn't have lied to you when you lost your memory. John shook his head and said indignantly, It's not your fault. Anyone can tell those terrible ideas came from Luke. He's been messing with me for years. Even my amnesia wasn't enough to stop him. I watched as John ranted endlessly about Luke, quietly deciding to keep the secret that my brother isn't too bright was. In fact, Luke. But to my surprise, John seemed to have gotten sharper. He continued, and he even pretended to be some random internet user to mess with me. If you're going to pretend to be a stranger, at least pick a better username. What a disaster. Just as I was about to defend Luke, John's tone suddenly shifted, and he added smugly, Don't worry. I've already dealt with him. What did you do? I asked cautiously. I revoked his right to be our baby's godfather, he said, looking utterly triumphant. Watching his self-satisfied expression, I silently took back my earlier thought that he'd gotten smarter. Even after regaining his memory, John didn't act much differently from before. He still treated me like royalty, as though I were the center of his universe. The marriage certificate had been put back in its place in the living room, and as I stared at it one day, I suddenly recalled the vows he had made during our wedding. Loving you has become the most natural thing in the world, he had said. Even when he'd forgotten me, forgotten everything about us, he had still remembered how to love me. And that, perhaps, was the happiest ending of all.